Good to see everyone again today. As the screen said, we're continuing our trip through Paul's letter to the Corinthians. And this morning we're going to be beginning at chapter 9, verse 18. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 18. Before we get started, let's begin with a prayer. Lord, we thank you for everything that you do for us. Thank you for all the blessings that you bestow upon us. And help us to be eternally grateful for all of the things that you do for us and the daily miracles of our lives, that many things sometimes we don't even notice. Lord, we're especially thankful for the blessings that you give to us through your Son Jesus and the opportunity that we have through him to have eternal life with you. Lord, just help us to be eager to share your gospel with the world so that as many as possible can come to have that same opportunity. Lord, we have many sick and many needy of our number. Just please continue to watch over them. And please help us to have the kind of heart that seeks out those who have those kinds of needs and to meet them the best that we can. Lord, please continue to watch over our spiritual leaders and just help them to continue to be good shepherds of your flock. And as a flock, just help us to be an aid and encouragement to those who have that task. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, so we're in chapter 9. And as I say, I think I've said this hundreds of times now. Well, not hundreds, that's hyperbole. The Church of Corinth is a church with divisions. So if you were to take out of this one thing about the Church of Corinth, that this is a church that is split, it has factions, divisions, whatever you want to call it, people with varying opinions, outlooks, backgrounds, etc. And they were using that to kind of almost work against each other on things. And starting in chapter 8, our immediate context is food sacrifice to idols. And obviously, that's not something we deal with today, but as we discussed, that's something that we deal with on the underlying principle behind it. And the Corinthians wrote to Paul previously this idea that we know that so while that context of idols and sacrifices and stuff, it doesn't affect us today directly, certainly doing things that might not violate our conscience, but yet other people, it might be sensitive to their conscience. That's something that we deal with on a very regular basis. And so that's something that can speak to us. We have to be careful how our actions affect other people. And so then in chapter 9, Paul uses his own freedoms as an example. So what Paul often does is that he doesn't make it just do as I say, don't do what I do. But Paul applies this to himself. And so that he has the right to be supported by the people that he delivers the gospel to. That he has a right to get monetary and material support from the people that he's giving this to. And so he has a cultural and biblical basis for that support. And so he makes very practical examples from everyday life. He even uses biblical examples of how those who are supported by a ministry owe that support to the people that delivers it. But Paul doesn't take that right. He forgoes that support since it might interfere with his success. And so that's more important to him than getting everything that he is owed. And so he's been given the responsibility of delivering the gospel. He has that direct mandate from God through Jesus. And so if he did that voluntarily, he'd have a wage. And this concept of wage will come up today. But if he had this voluntary action, if he didn't have that direct mission, he'd be just doing a job. And just like any job, you deserve compensation for that. You deserve a wage. But he's not doing this voluntarily. He was given a command. And so as one who has been trusted by God with such a command, he's been given this stewardship over this responsibility. Last Wednesday we talked about the parable of talents. And so it's kind of like those people who had been given those talents weren't their own. They were given those to invest them and to increase whatever that master's kingdom was, or that master's business, his affairs, his whatever. And so similarly, Paul has been entrusted with a similar stewardship. He has been given a responsibility. And so Paul says, woe unto him if he doesn't fulfill the trust given to him. Kind of like in that parable where the guy who buries the talents, woe was unto him. Bad things happen to him because he did not use the things that he was entrusted with. And so Paul has this responsibility. And so therefore, because he has that responsibility, what lengths is he going to go through in order to accomplish that responsibility? And so Paul applies that to himself. How do we each act to his personal circumstances just to do this. But what does Paul get out of it? If he's not taking this wage, what is he getting? And so if he's a steward, what does he get in return for his efforts? And so Paul's going to ultimately answer this in verse 23, but he's going to kind of build up and explain that. So while delivering the gospel, Paul's doing this without cost. He doesn't require support, so he doesn't use up his authority, so to speak. And so he doesn't waste the authority that he has on things that don't matter. And so, Paul could get support, but yet that desire for support and that lobbying for it and everything, that might become a distraction, and people might not listen to him on more important matters. And so he might waste that authority that he has. And so he saves that up so that authority can be used on greater things. Something that each and every one of us can do. We can worry about getting what we deserve and exactly what we deserve, but we can kind of waste that on and that right for the sake of things that are actually more important. And so Paul, even though he's free from all, he has enslaved himself to all. And he did that for a purpose, so that he can gain more. He can gain more people. So even though he's completely free, just as any of us are completely free in Christ, because of his concern, not for himself, but his concern for the master that he serves, he has enslaved himself so that he might gain things that are more important, that are better for God's kingdom. And so he's able to reach more people because he gave up his rights. And so similarly for us, we can give up some of the rights that we have within the kingdom of God in order to benefit that kingdom beyond just ourselves. And so we can bicker about getting exactly what we deserve, or we can all work together and compromise and give up a little bit for the greater benefit of the kingdom. Okay? And so what lengths is Paul going to go to in order to accomplish this? So verse 20, and to Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain Jews. To those under law, I became as one under law, myself not being under law, so that I might gain those under the law. To those without law, I became as one without law, not being without the law of God, but in the law of Christ, so that I might gain those without law. To the weak, I became one who was weak, so that I might gain the weak. To all, I have become all things, so that I might certainly save some. That I do all things on account of the gospel, so that I might become a fellow sharer of it. And so, big kind of section, I like to divide that up, but all of this kind of goes together. It's all one logical piece. And you can see what Paul's done. To Jews, he became as a Jew. And he did that so that he could gain Jews. I think it kind of starts out easy because Paul was born a Jewish person, so that's not giving up a whole lot, right? But yeah, you can think of what he did like with people like Timothy, right? I mean, that was maybe more difficult with Timothy. I mean, he took on the outward signs of being a Jew in order to help deliver the gospel to more people. And so you have Timothy in Acts 16. And so, Timothy gave up some huge personal liberty, and read that chapter if you want to understand that. But he gave up some huge personal liberty in order to reach more people. And so what are we going to give up in order to reach more people? To those under the law. And so Paul often justifies his theology, even here, by using the law. He was talking about how he owed certain support, and he uses the old law as an example of that. And so he does that very often. So as a basis, it was useful in winning people over. So he definitely used that for his benefit. To the weak. And so in order to reach the weak, he became weak. How many of us want to become weak? How many of us want to become dependent upon somebody else? I think almost universally, we want to be strong. We want to be the person that people depend on. We want to be the person who is admired and respected or whatever. But yet, we look at Paul. Paul was in prison. He was shipwrecked. There were times when he was stoned and left for dead. Very trying circumstances that you might even consider a person who was weak. But that's a person who's in danger. That's not a person who is just depending upon themselves and their own might and their own resources. And so to think about all of those instances, how often did those trying circumstances help Paul to win people over? So to the weak, he became one who was weak, and he was able to reach people who were in similar similarly speaking, we can become all kinds of things in order to save people. Principles and ways of life and statuses that we might not currently have, we might give up in order to help benefit the kingdom of God. And so, maybe I value myself because of the kind of life that I have. I might say, well, I'm this, therefore I can never reach these people. I'm not ever going to give up this. But yet maybe if I give that up, I can be, a better example of the gospel, and I can share that gospel more effectively. And so I might say, well, I'm not educated, then therefore, how can I reach educated people? Well, I can maybe work on my education. I can, speak to people like that. Well, maybe I'm educated, and I'm trying to reach people who are not so educated. Well, I can kind of give up some of that respect and some of those titles and some of the way that a person talks in order to reach that person. You can use the same thing with wealth, resources, status, anything. There isn't anything that we shouldn't be able to give up and change ourselves about just to help strengthen that kingdom of God. And so he does all of that on account of the gospel. He's doing all of that for the benefit of sharing the gospel. And so there is a mission. He's not giving these things up because giving things up makes you better, or changing makes you better, but he's doing all of those things for a greater goal, a greater good, and that's sharing the gospel of Christ. And he's doing all of that so he can be a fellow sharer, and he has that chance to be a participant in the gift that God has given us through Jesus Christ. And so he has these responsibilities to help grow the kingdom. And so if he just sort of hoards those resources and that love and blessings that God gives to him, then he's not really being a good steward of that. But yet by being a good steward, that helps greater his chance, that it helps him to achieve that goal that God has given to each and every one of us, that he can be that fellow sharer. And ultimately that's his reward for following his responsibilities. And so his reward isn't getting in this life everything that he deserves, getting everything that he has a right to, but ultimately the thing that he wants is for as many people to be fellow sharers in the gospel and for him to be a beneficiary of that gospel himself. And anything else is really nothing. Paul elsewhere says he counts everything else that he had in his life but loss. It was garbage to him. But yet he wanted to just preach Christ and Christ crucified and get people into that kingdom. And he himself wanted to benefit into that kingdom. So everything else didn't matter. So how hard should we fight for our rights? And fight for the rights that we have under the gospel? How hard should we fight for it? Divide churches, hurt people, and drive people away? Or ultimately things that don't matter. And the thing that matters is getting people into heaven and getting ourselves into heaven. Any other thoughts here? Yes?
Would that all involve humility?
That would definitely involve humility. I agree. Because, the opposite of that is pride, of course. And it's like, I don't want to give up what I deserve. And ultimately, when a person says that, they're thinking that they're more important than the other person. But that humility, if I'm putting myself at or below that other person, they're important. I'm not the one who's important. They're important. So it's a difference in focus. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
The more I understand what's going on, I see how Paul is changing the culture of the era at the time.
Oh, yeah.
That the Jews didn't change culture like this.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, God gave the Jews the opportunity, but they didn't use it, I guess.
Right. I mean, you look at even, the Greek-Roman culture, and you look at the Jewish culture, and it's kind of opposite of this. You look at the Greek and Roman culture, and you have the celebration of all of these heroes and things like that, people who differentiated themselves from the rest of the pack, and we're going to kind of talk about this in a second, especially within Corinth, they appreciated winners. People who, wore that crown, people who won the competition, and all of that, they definitely appreciated that. And then on the Jewish side of that, there's countless Jewish writings that talk about exactly what your rights are under the law. Exactly where that precipice is, where you're following the law and you're not following the law. And so rather than saying, what can you give up in order to benefit the kingdom of God, it's what exactly can I get away with so I get what's fair for me. And the example that I always think of in that there's, in part of the commentary on the law, a lot of these rabbis giving their opinion, just like legal opinions today, basically. Exactly what our laws of the land is. exactly what can I get? What are my rights exactly under the law? And think about, how much that would hurt somebody else for them to exercise that kind of right, That's not a good thing. So it's completely inverted with the law of Christ. Anybody else? Yes?
I think Paul had to really have a good understanding of people
Mm-hmm.
and how to reach people
Mm-hmm.
because he apparently had to play a number of different character roles
Oh, yeah.
in order to bring the gospel to those that had different understandings.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Yeah, he had to become all kinds of things. A lot of people with different backgrounds. I mean, just from the sheer geography of the places that he visited, it would have to be a lot of people with different traditions, backgrounds, cultures, etc. And so he was willing to give up what was comfortable for him for what was the most beneficial for his kingdom.
I think the Lord gave him a good talent.
He did give him a good talent, for sure. And he used that talent, didn't he? Any other thoughts? Any other thoughts? I missed anybody? Okay. Well, moving along. So I think Paul's going to slightly change subject here. I feel like he's bridging two subjects. And so he's kind of changing gears. This kind of applies to the previous passage, but I think it really applies to what's coming up. And so, verse 24. Oh, before I read all of that, again, this section really would resonate with the people of Corinth. Because as I talked about way long ago, it seems forever ago, how they had what was called the Isthmian Games. It was part of the Pan-Hellenic Games. The Olympic Games would have been one that we're most familiar with. And then regionally around Corinth, there was something called the Isthmian Games. Instead of like the olive laurel crown, you would compete for this pine crown. There were like little pine needles on it. Even poetry of all things. Could you imagine a poetry competition at the Olympics every 4 years, right? A poetry slam. And so, yeah, they were very familiar with competition and winning. So kind of keep that in mind when Paul's saying these things. So verse 24. Do you not know that all who run a race indeed run, but one receives the prize? Run thusly, that you might take hold of it. But everyone who contends exercises self-control in all things, so that they may indeed receive a perishable crown, but we contend for an imperishable one. But indeed I run thusly, not as aimlessly. I box thusly, not as beating air, but I bruise my body and bring it into slavery, lest I myself may become disqualified after proclaiming to others. And so like I say, this kind of applies to what we're about to talk about, but it also kind of applies to what we've been talking about. So there is this kind of spirit of competition here. And, it's a pretty common thing. In all things, you might not want to wake up at the crack of dawn to kind of train for whatever sport you're trying to train for, but you do that so that you can become better and hopefully become the best. I think the opposite of that is, I don't know if you remember Saturday Night Live like years and years ago, 1974, John Belushi, and he was acting as if he was this Olympic person, and he was like training for track and field or whatever, and part of his training regimen was little chocolate donuts. And so he's like sitting there, and he's got this little chocolate donut, and he's eating it, he's got a cigarette in one hand and everything, and he's training for this, track and field. Could you imagine anybody seriously training for the Olympics like that, chowing down on some donuts, and then you're going to just run a marathon? I don't think that would be a very pleasant kind of thing. And similarly speaking, we can't train like that. It requires more discipline. We have to fight whatever urges we have, whether it's donuts or sleeping in or not training or whatever. We have to give all of that up so that we can become the best that we can be. And so we have to exercise self-control, and so that we may indeed receive a perishable crown for these physical kind of exercises that we do. And again, like I say, the crowns that they were competing for in those Hellenic games were those plants. I mean, they were literally, like pine leaves or laurel leaves or olive leaves, depending on which game that you were playing. But it was a plant. And so think about how long that crown is going to last. It's not like a metal crown like a medieval king would wear, but it is literally just a wreath of plants. And that's going to just sort of, after a couple months, it's going to wilt, it's going to go brown, and it's going to die, and it's going to go away. But think of all the training and all of the effort and all of the competition and all the desire that kind of goes into that in order to win that crown that's rotten and in the garbage in a couple months. How much more are we going to strive and have self-discipline and work hard for a crown that's going to last forever, for eternity? And so we should devote ourselves to that even more so. But we don't always do that. And so we compete for that. Now, indeed, I run thusly. And so because he wants to get that crown, he doesn't run aimlessly. You don't just have a training regimen without any kind of a plan. I feel like I'm going to train this way today. I might do something else tomorrow. You don't run aimlessly. You don't box and beat the air. If a person is fighting and training to fight, you don't just sort of box the air, but you actually have like a pad or you spar with a partner or something, but you don't just beat the air. Similarly, like a person who's training to run a marathon, you don't get up and run like 5 feet and say, "Oh, that was pretty good today." You actually put a challenge in front of yourself. And so, similarly, we need to do that. And so, but I bruise my body and bring it into slavery. That's what we do whenever we train. I use that "we" very loosely there. but yeah, whenever people train, they do that. They bruise themselves. They bring their body into subjection to make it into something better than what it is now. Spiritually, we need to do that with ourselves. We need to be in this idea of training, that we have this discipline. We become a better version of ourselves over time. And we do that so that lest I myself become disqualified after proclaiming to others. And so, if you don't follow the rules of the competition, and if you don't do all of that training, you're not even going to qualify for the race, and you're going to get kicked out of it. So similarly speaking, we can kind of be lazy in this competition, and we can disqualify ourselves. And we can disqualify ourselves by even just not following the rules. We can kind of cut corners. There's the people who run marathons. I think the one that I always think of, I think this was in the 70s or something. The lady is running the marathon, and like partway through, she kind of ducks out of the race and then gets into a subway car and then goes all the way down and then gets off the subway, kind of hides out for a little bit, and then re-enters the race and gets a really good time. And yet eventually she was discovered, but she was disqualified. She didn't get the prize for the race because she didn't follow the rules of the race. And similarly speaking, when we're delivering the gospel, we might think, well, I could do this and I could win, but it's not necessarily sanctioned by God. But I could do this and I could win people. We could disqualify ourselves if we try to cut those corners and we get on that spiritual subway car and kind of cheat the race a little bit. We can be disqualified. And Paul is saying he himself could be disqualified. This person who is, a faithful Christian who's been through all of the things that he's been through, he could get disqualified even after proclaiming the gospel to other people. So there is this sense that we can lose everything that we've worked for. That we could do all of that training and have all of that discipline and make all of those physical sacrifices in our lives, but not benefit from it because we don't follow the rules that God has given to us. And so even though we may have salvation at one point, we can do something to kind of lose that and disqualify ourselves from that. So it takes discipline, it takes effort. And it's not always pleasant, it's not always easy. That word contend up there in verse 25 is the word agonizomai. Say that 10 times fast. But that's where we get the word agony. And so that idea of contending for that prize is trying, it's troubling, it's difficult sometimes. But yet we have to power beyond that pain and try it anyway. And the outcome is definitely worth it. I spoke a lot. Any other thoughts? Okay. I either really covered it or I put you guys to sleep. All right, continuing on. So that gets us into chapter 10. And like I say, I think that's a bit of a bridge because Paul can take that idea of competition and he can apply it to himself and say, by becoming all things to all people, this is what I've done. I've laid aside every encumbrance and I've competed as in this race. I've done that. But I think it also applies to what's coming up because we're still talking about eating meat sacrificed to idols. And so there's this idea that these people know that idols are nothing in the world. And I think it can apply to them too because they're kind of dipping their toes into this sort of pagan world. They're dipping their toes into the world itself. They may not be following God and God's principles. And by doing so, they're kind of putting themselves at risk. Kind of similarly to that person who's training for that race or training for that athletic event. I'll just skip a day of practice. It's not a big deal. Or I'll just go and I'll have that little chocolate donut today. It's no big deal. I'll just dip my toes into that. And similarly speaking, that could become a bad habit and get you into trouble. And so I think it kind of goes into the next section, what we're going to talk about here as well. So verse 1. For I do not want you to be ignorant, brothers, that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they were drinking from the spiritual rock accompanying them, but the rock was Christ. Promise we have not changed subjects, but Paul again is using the Old Testament. He's using this to prove a bigger point, and it's the same point. We're still on the same subject. And so Paul is focusing on the Exodus here. And so all of these events that Paul has outlined here are from the Exodus. And so there's an emphasis here on all, if you notice. And so all our fathers under the cloud, all of them baptized, all of them ate spiritual food, all drank the same spiritual drink. And so you have this sense of all that's very important here, all of them. And so all of our fathers were under the cloud. And you can go back to Exodus 13 and 14. And that cloud, at first that was sort of the guidance of God. And they received the protection of God. And so we have that cloud, kind of that pillar of a cloud being in front of this, band of Israelites leaving Egypt and, going towards this promised land. And that cloud provided for them direction. It provided them a sense of where they were supposed to be going. And so, we have a similar thing for us as well. But then that cloud is more so. If we look at Exodus 4, starting in 19, then an angel of the God who was going before, and this is when Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he's kind of starting to chase after them again. And an angel of God who was going before the host of Israel moved and went behind them. So that cloud that was guiding them moved and then went behind them. And the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. And there was a cloud and the darkness, and it lit up the night without one coming near the other at all night. And so that cloud was also a protection for those people. So we usually think of it as just the thing that guided them through the wilderness. But in that instance, it was also this thing that protected them. And while that cloud would have gone from in front of them to behind them, that cloud would have been sort of around them and over them, and they would have been enveloped in that cloud. And so we'll kind of come back to that thread in a second. And all our fathers passed through the sea. And so that's in Exodus 14. So right around that same time, the Red Sea parts, and you have that sea on both sides of the Israelite nation. And they walk through that sea, and then the sea closes up, and it swallows up Pharaoh's army. That army can't follow them. They can't continue to pursue them. And in fact, we don't hear from that army. It doesn't continue to be this constant threat, but yet that Red Sea is the sort of barrier that stops them. And so they went through that sea in order to be protected. And so again, you have this sense of protection and deliverance by God from those past troubles. And I think what we're going to see here is that there's a huge relation between this wandering in the wilderness that the Israelites have and the quote-unquote wandering in the wilderness that each and every one of us has as we are trying to get to our promised land. And God has provided for these people very richly. It's a big thing to have this cloud, go in front of you to guide you, to protect you. It's a big thing to have this Red Sea kind of part. God was doing a lot in order to protect these people. And he says that all were baptized. They were immersed in the cloud and in the sea. And so I think, there's definitely an allusion to baptism here, that cloud, went in front of them, and then in them they were surrounded by that, and then behind them. And so they were immersed in that cloud.
And they were definitely sort of immersed in that sea. You can kind of think of them, with that sea parted, that it was on all sides. They were in the midst of that sea. And that's sort of an allusion to what we have in baptism and what happens with baptism, that the sins of our former life don't get to follow us and chase us throughout our entire lives through this journey, but yet the penalty of that is kind of stopped at Christ's death, burial, and resurrection, and then our subsequent baptism. That kind of is the fulfillment of what we read about there in Exodus. And so we see this kind of same thing. And so that sort of immersion, that baptism, separated the Israelites from the people that pursued them. All ate from the same food and drink. And so they had manna for food in Exodus 16. Moses struck the rock for water in Exodus 17. And so they received support from God, like in every conceivable way, right? And all of them received that support. They all received these things, everything that they needed to be freed from this mighty nation of Egypt. And so this, ragtag group of people who was a bunch of nomads out of the east were kind of brought into Egypt, with everything that happened with Joseph, and then they ended up becoming enslaved by Egypt. This nation that was way mightier than them, way stronger than them, they were able to escape because of God's providence, and that God gave them everything that they needed to do that. And so the conclusion then, since God did that for all of them, that must mean that God was pleased with all of them, right? That he was happy with them, right? And that they all made it to that promised land, right? And God did so much for them that every single one of those Israelites that escaped Egypt, they made it to the promised land, right? You guys are all shaking your heads no, because they absolutely didn't, did they? And so that's kind of, I think, why he says that rock was Christ, because we know what happened with that rock, right? That Moses struck that rock, right? And he didn't do that in the way that God wanted him to do that. And that rock helped Israel to not perish. But that rock is where Moses and Israel fall short because of that doubting, because of that grumbling. And so Moses falls short. That rock is Christ. That is the thing that brings us forward where Moses and the law could never, and the Israelites could never obtain for themselves. And so we have something better. So Numbers 20, and the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe in me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. But yet that rock that we have, Christ, gets us to where Moses could never take them. And I think that that's very, very deliberate here in the language in 1 Corinthians 10, because when he says the rock was Christ, the way that it's worded is that he absolutely is the rock. That rock is Christ, and Christ is the rock, one-on-one. It's a very special wording. I'm trying to say this in a very not boring way. In order to divide what is the subject of a sentence and the predicate nominative of a sentence in Greek, you typically have the article in front of the subject, and you don't have the article in front of the predicate nominative. Please feel free to fall asleep right now. And that's usually what you have. And you need to do that in Greek because the word order is a lot more fluid in the way that it works. So you could kind of jumble around the words, and it's still going to mean the same thing because of the articles and the construction and all of that. But here, you have both an article in front of the rock and you have an article in front of Christ. You don't see that very often. That's a very rare thing. And so that means that these things are a one-to-one, that there is no other rock besides Christ, and only Christ is the rock. And so those two things are 100% absolutely the same thing. And so for us, that's the only thing that can save us, and the only thing that can deliver us is Christ, who is that rock. The best parallel, and I hope this isn't a dumb example, but that turns it into what's called a convertible proposition. That sounds like something you'd buy from the car store or something, the auto lot. But what that means is like, hopefully this makes sense. Lou Alcindor is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Does that make sense? Cassius Clay is Muhammad Ali, right? Both of those are 100% the same people. They're just two different names that those same people went through in different parts of their lives. And so that's kind of the same thing here, is that rock in every way, shape, and form is Christ. In every way, shape, and form, Christ is that rock. So no other. Yeah.
that rock is still there.
Oh, really? Oh, that's pretty cool. I bet he didn't try to touch that rock with a 20-foot pole.
They've opened up those areas now to
Yeah, that's really cool. That's really cool. Any other thoughts? Any other comments? I've talked a lot again. Hopefully I didn't say too much. Okay. Moving along with that thought. So here's the actual thing. God did all of this stuff for those people, but a huge exception here. But God was not well pleased with most of them. He did all of this stuff for all of them, yet he was not pleased with most of them. And he's going to explain why. Paul's going to explain why. For they were strewn in the wilderness. That's really not a very pretty picture. You know, you can think of these thousands and thousands of Israelites wandering in the wilderness. And then Paul is saying they're strewn about. You know, there's this evidence. Their, bleached bones are sitting there throughout the wilderness. And they didn't all make it. And they all, a lot of them met a pretty bad end. But, verse 6, these became patterns for us not to be desires of evil, just as they desired. And so they were patterns. They're examples for us. They're for us to learn from so that we don't make the same mistakes that they made. And we don't desire the bad things that they desired. And so that we can learn and we can perhaps have better things than they had. Okay. Moving along, verse 7. So now he's going to talk about these specific instances where these people who had everything in the world, they had all of the preparation, they had all of those blessings from God, yet they still put themselves at odds with God. Neither become idol worshippers, even as some of them. As it has been written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Neither should we commit sexual immorality, even as some of them committed sexual immorality. And 23,000 fell in one day. Neither should we test Christ, even as some of them tested and were being destroyed by serpents. Neither grumble, as some of them grumbled and perished by the destroyer. So all of this, again, still in the Exodus and throughout the time that they were wandering in the wilderness. Neither become idol worshipers. Even near the beginning, we have Exodus 32. Moses goes and he is getting the commandments from God and he is speaking with God at Sinai. And I guess that the Israelites kind of look at their watch and they say, man, Moses is taking kind of a long time. They don't say, well, maybe, we'll maybe play some Scrabble or something, kind of pass the time a little bit. What do they think? Still fresh in their minds, walking through the Red Sea, having the cloud to guide them, having the manna that's given to them. They don't just look at their watch and say, you know what, this all-powerful God who's taking care of us, maybe we'll just wait a little bit longer. They say, you know what, we need to make ourselves a golden calf. And we need to do that. We need to make an idol for ourselves. And so right out the gate, they start messing up. And 32:10 says, now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may not burn against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you. And so, they made this idol, and this was what God's response was going to be. And Moses pled, and successfully pled, to spare these people. And yet that was going to be the response. And yet these people made that idol, that calf, and then they ate, they drank, and they rose up to play. They had a meal, and they got up, and they decided to start playing some games and have some leisure time, all the while completely ignorant of that destruction that God was going to make them responsible for. And so similarly speaking, when we kind of dip our toes into things that we shouldn't, we could be sowing the seeds of our own destruction, and we could be just eating and drinking and playing and not even know it. And life is just 100% perfect for us, even though that wrath is kind of stored up for us. So something that speaks to us. Neither commit sexual immorality. Numbers 25, Moab. And so again, they took up the ways and bowed to the gods of those people. Neither test Christ in Numbers 21. So from that, that's 21:4, from Mount Hor, they set out by the way to the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. And the people became impatient on the way. Again, impatient. And the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we loathe this worthless food. And so there were fiery serpents that came in to response to that, and many people died. And so, bad stuff happened. And, you have this manna coming from heaven, and they call it worthless food. It's just a really bad attitude, and they became impatient for their situation. And this word test here, we're going to talk about this next week because we're almost out of time. But there's in verse 13, that word is going to be used again. And so I think we need to use it in a very similar sense. And so this idea that these people were complaining, and they were kind of testing God, it was like they were complaining so that they could kind of maybe, complain loud enough and get what they wanted. Instead of manna falling from heaven, it'd be like ribeye steaks or something. I want to move to that country. But they were kind of testing God by their complaint. Neither should they grumble. That's from number 16. And this is Korah's rebellion. And so Korah is upset, and he grumbles about Moses' status. And then his people, and all of his goods are just swallowed up by the earth. And then the 250 people that offer incense for Korah, they're consumed by fire. And then the people that witness this, and they see Korah get punished for this, they then start to grumble, and they say, well, that's not fair, that's not right. And 14,700 people die before atonement is made to stop the plague that's killing them. And so, we shouldn't grumble just and complain just as those people did. And it's kind of interesting to me that the people that weren't even affected by this directly one way or the other, that's the brunt of the people that got affected. And it's kind of interesting that we have a parallel with that with us, right? How many times do we get upset and we grumble about circumstances that have absolutely nothing to do with us? And so that small thing of somebody complaining, a tiny group, you then have a much larger group that it can affect, and that complaining kind of spreads. And that can be a punishment from God, and bad things can happen from that. So I know we're about out of time, but I think that what we gather from this is that God provided for these people richly, and they thought that they could abuse that grace of God and do whatever they want and just continue to complain and just do whatever their will was, and there were consequences to that. Similarly speaking, in the new covenant, we can think that we have this abundance of riches from God. God has provided for us so much through his Son, therefore, I can just do whatever I want. But similarly speaking, there can be consequences to our actions, and we need to be careful. And so, like this eating meat sacrificed to the idol, it might lead to a separation between the person and God, that they may not get to the place that they want, that little tiny thing can lead to more and more and more, and it ends up being open rebellion. And we've got to be mindful of that. And so with that and our bell, we will put a pin in that for right now, and Lord willing, we will continue next week. Thank you so much for your attention and your comments.